spectacular impression. Built in 1994, this has served as an entrance to this museum, this iconic museum. Hill Goodspeed, our historian, was here when it was first created, and he's here to tell you about some of the neat features of the National Naval Aviation Museum Quarterdeck. Hill, take it away.
Thank you, Captain Gillum. I appreciate that kind introduction, and welcome Facebook fans to the latest edition of History Up Close. Thought we'd do something a little bit different today. Rather than focusing on one aircraft, give you a tour of the multiple aircraft that ring the museum quarterdeck. And the quarterdeck is the entrance to the National Naval Aviation Museum, and some might wonder why we call it the quarterdeck. Well, the quarterdeck on a ship is the ceremonial entrance point where people come aboard and depart the ship. So we felt it was going to be a real fitting name for the entrance to this great museum. And the first aircraft I'm going to talk about is the one right behind me. You may hear some of the Blue Angels jet noise during this broadcast, and this was actually the first type of jet the Blue Angels flew, the F9F Panther. And this is one of the Korean War stalwarts as far as naval aviation is concerned. It was, along with the F2H Banshee, the introduction to the jet age for naval aviation in combat. So the F9F flew a lot of interdiction missions, combat air patrols, and actually it was one of these aircraft flown by a guy named Lieutenant Commander William Amen, who shot down the first jet by a naval aviator in air-to-air combat. But as I said, mainly flew a lot of interdiction missions, which was low-level ground attack, and a number of famous individuals spent time in the cockpit of an F9F Panther. One of them was Boston Red Sox slugger Ted Williams, who was a recalled Marine reservist. Flew this type of aircraft in combat, actually made a fiery crash landing in one of them. And one of his squadron mates was a guy named John Glenn, who you know is the first American to orbit the Earth. He took so much battle damage flying these aircraft that his nickname in Korea was Magnet. And there's a very famous photograph of him standing underneath the tail of one of these, and it's peppered by anti-aircraft fire. Another one who flew it was a future astronaut, Neil Armstrong, and he flew with VF-51, the Screaming Eagles off USS Essex. And on one flight, he was flying so low that he actually clipped a high-tension wire that had been put up by the North Koreans in hopes of having a US aircraft hit it while flying low and making an attack. And it knocked off about 6 feet of this starboard wing, as you could see right here. But Armstrong managed to get the aircraft under control, up to altitude, and he headed over the 38th parallel so he could punch out over friendly territory. So you have a young officer showing tremendous piloting skills and also being very calm and cool under pressure. So it was definitely no surprise that he was chosen to command Apollo 11 in its landmark flight to the lunar surface. Ours is actually a combat veteran. This particular airplane spent time in 2 Marine squadrons flying from airfields ashore in South Korea, and it finished the war flying with VF-151, in whose markings it is painted now, flying from the USS Boxer. And it ended its career right here behind the museum at Sherman Field, where it was an advanced jet trainer. But you'll notice a couple of notable features about the Panther. You have these tip tanks. It's a straight wing jet, not a swept wing, so its performance is not as high as the swept wing jets. You'll notice underneath the wings mock-ups of 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, which were very effective in the ground attack mission for this type of aircraft. Now, the aircraft on the wall is probably one that is in the most unique display position of any airplane in this museum. It is the D558-1 Skystreak, and the press nicknamed the aircraft the Crimson Test Tube, as you can see why. And this aircraft was a National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, test airplane. And NACA was the forerunner of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And this aircraft, for a period of about 5 days in August of 1946, was the fastest aircraft in the air. It broke a speed record, or established a speed record, over Muroc Army Airfield, which later became known as Edwards Air Force Base. And a gentleman by the name of Commander Turner F. Caldwell flew the aircraft in a record run of 640 miles per hour. And as I said, that record stood for a grand total of 5 days until a fellow naval aviator of Caldwell's, a guy by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Marion Carl, broke that record. And of course, just a few months later, in October of 1947, the speed of sound was broken by Chuck Yeager. So this aircraft really was left behind pretty quickly by the X-1 in that famous flight. But it is a very interesting aircraft in its design. There was no ejection seat for it. They figured that with a high-speed aircraft like this, there was no way for the pilot to get out physiologically. The pilot wouldn't be able to withstand the tremendous pressures placed on his body. So what the nose would do in an emerging situation, the nose would pop off and the pilot would get out that way. In its original test configuration, it had sensors all over the fuselage to give readings as the engineers were studying the design of aircraft and how they reacted in high-speed flight. So this was the gateway to the subsonic and then supersonic age, which has gone to the tremendous platforms we have today. This was one of the early test beds, and definitely it's an eye-opener when you first walk in here. Now we're going to make our way around the mezzanine of the museum, Quarterdeck, and a lot of interesting displays up here as we walk along. You'll see here on my left the 1000 trap board that highlights those aviators and naval flight officers who've achieved 1,000 or more carrier landings. So it's a very unique fraternity within an already very unique fraternity of naval aviation personnel who land and launch from aircraft carriers. But the second aircraft we're going to talk about as I pass beneath this Grumman product is the FM2 Wildcat. And it might look very familiar to you because we've already done a segment on the F4F Wildcat, which was the Grumman-built version of this plane. But go back to World War II, a lot of aircraft manufacturers trying to build various designs that would meet the needs of the war. And Grumman had designed this one, the Wildcat, and then they developed the F6F Hellcat, which we featured in a History Up Close previously. And so what they did is they took the design of the Wildcat and they subcontracted that design out to another company to build it. And so that company was General Motors. So if you drive around a General Motors vehicle during World War II, there was no need for civilian automobiles. So General Motors repurposed their production line and they built a company or established a company called Eastern Aircraft. And Eastern built the FM2 Wildcat, which was a Grumman, based on the Grumman design, but they were called FMs, whereas Grumman Wildcats were called F4Fs. Very similar in look. I mean, one of the ways you can tell the FM apart from the F4F is the vertical stabilizer is a little bit taller on the FMs as compared to the F4Fs. So these were used in a variety of roles. Primarily, they flew from escort carriers, which were the small deck carriers, which in the Atlantic were involved in hunting for German U-boats. So a number of German U-boats were actually sunk because of fire from these particular aircraft working in conjunction with TBM Avengers. And they were also used for close air support for a lot of the invasions in the Pacific. And during one of those invasions in October 1944, a number of these were flying off escort carriers when a massive Japanese fleet came into the vicinity of where the escort carriers were operating and attacked those escort carriers and their destroyers and destroyer escorts that were supporting them. And so these aircraft, which did not carry the ordnance required to sink a ship, because they were designed, or they were performing the mission of attacking enemy installations on the beach, a number of FM2 Wildcat pilots launched from those escort carriers and made repeated strafing runs against these powerful Japanese ships that were bombarding the escort carriers from which they flew. And even after they ran out of ammunition, those brave pilots kept making dummy runs after dummy run after dummy run against those Japanese ships in an effort to try to keep them away from the thin-skinned escort carriers. So it was an amazing display of heroism. One of those pilots was a guy named Ken Snyder, who was a volunteer who really showed me a lot of what I know here at the museum as I've developed as a historian. So always remember Ken when I see that aircraft. Now, as we make our way to the center part of the atrium, we're going to see an example of the oldest, the first aircraft that the Navy ever bought. It's the Curtiss A1 Triad. And you'll see it is very primitive in design. And people ask, why do they call it the Triad? Well, they called it the A1 because it could operate in 3 different dimensions. So look at the aircraft behind me. You'll see a float, and it can operate from water. You'll see it has wheels, so it could operate from land. And obviously the 3rd dimension was flying in the air. So the Triad was ordered in, the requisitions for it were prepared in May 1911. And the day that those requisitions were prepared is the day that the Navy celebrates as the birthday of naval aviation. And so this airplane actually was responsible, or was the platform on which the Navy's first aviators trained, including Naval Aviator number 1, a guy named Lieutenant Theodore Ellison, and Naval Aviator number 3, an individual named Lieutenant John Towers. And they performed some very interesting experiments using the AA-1. One was a long-distance cross-country flight. So when we think cross-country today, that's flying from Pensacola to, or wherever you're from on the East Coast, to California. Back then, a cross-country flight was 112 miles. That was a record cross-country flight that this thing established in its early operations. They also were experimenting with how to launch these aircraft from a ship or using a catapult. So the A-1 was used for some experiments where they actually put Ellison on top of a suspended wire, and he would rev up the engine and go down that wire as a method of launching from a ship. And they also experimented with these aircraft operating or actually testing the first catapults. And unfortunately for Lieutenant Ellison, one of those experiments that he participated in, the aircraft went right off the catapult into the water. And so there's a picture of him actually climbing out or sort of sitting on the pontoon of the A-1 as he finished up that unsuccessful flight. This particular A-1 is not a real one. There are no real ones that exist. It is a replica, and it was built along with one other one to commemorate the 1961 50th anniversary of naval aviation. And one of them was a flying example, one of them was not. This is the non-flying example, but it has been a fixture here at the Naval Aviation Museum as a link to the earliest days of U.S. naval aviation. Now we're going to head downstairs so we can talk about our final 2 aircraft here in the quarterdeck. Now we're on the floor of the quarterdeck. We're going to make our way over to one of our newest exhibit areas, which is a replica flight deck of USS Nimitz, complete with an island. It also serves as our large screen theater ticket counter. The aircraft I want to talk about is the one above me. It's an A-4 Skyhawk. And it was designed in the 1950s when the Navy was seeking to find a lighter weight aircraft, one that was smaller in size that could still deliver tactical nuclear weapons. And this was the product. It was designed by a guy named Ed Heineman. So one of the nicknames of the Skyhawk was Heineman's Hot Rod. It was also called the Tinker Toy because of its small size. And so these actually could carry tactical nuclear weapons, but they made a name for themselves delivering conventional ordnance during the Vietnam War. They were workhorses of the Rolling Thunder campaign over North Vietnam, and they flew with many Marine squadrons from air bases in South Vietnam. More Skyhawks were shot down than any other aircraft in naval aviation during the Vietnam War. Among those shot down was in an A-4 were Vice Admiral Jim Stockdale, then Commander Jim Stockdale, who went on to receive the Medal of Honor, and also future Senator John McCain was flying an aircraft like this when he was shot down. This particular one is painted in very unique markings. It's painted in an aircraft, markings of an aircraft called Lady Jessie. And it was a famous aircraft during the Vietnam War. The story was that there was a naval aviator, his name was Dick Perry. And before he joined the Navy, he worked at a casino in Reno. And the casino was owned by Jessie Beck and her husband. And she befriended this young man, and really they kept in touch through his flight training and his naval service. And she was a very great friend, not only of Dick Perry, but his squadron, VA-164, the Ghost Riders. She would send them care packages. She would host the squadron at the casino in Reno, and just was a great foundation of support when they were flying in some of the most difficult times of the Vietnam War. And in honor of Jessie, they nicknamed Dick Perry's aircraft Lady Jessie. And tragically, Perry was shot down during a combat mission and killed in action. But the tradition of Lady Jessie continued. So after Perry's loss, the squadron commander's aircraft in VA-164 all the way through the service in Vietnam and the end of the squadron's existence was named Lady Jessie. And so we honor Dick Perry's memory and also the contributions of Lady Jessie to naval aviation with the paint scheme on this A4 Skyhawk. And as I proceed forward on the Nimitz flight deck, you'll see we try to break down a lot of the components of an aircraft carrier as we go across here. It's probably be a topic of a future History Up Close. Passing the model of USS George H.W. Bush, which is the final Nimitz class aircraft carrier. And we'll focus on the aircraft above me, which is an H1JC Cobra. And the C Cobra came into being during the Vietnam War. The Army developed an aircraft called the Cobra, which had a single engine, and the Marine Corps saw this type of aircraft being of great benefit to them as a gunship for all their operations. And so they developed one with two engines. It was called the C Cobra. And it, in the Vietnam War, it would carry rocket pods, which you can see depicted there, and had armament in the nose. And these aircraft could deliver really devastating ground attack. And the squadron that flew them during the Vietnam War was HMA 369, now called HMLA 369. And they participated in an operation actually off the coast of North Vietnam. You don't really think about US helicopters operating in North Vietnam, but this squadron flew from a ship called the USS Cleveland, and they participated in an operation in 1972 called Operation Marhuck, which was Marine Hunter Killer. And these aircraft flew along the coast of North Vietnam, interdicting the supply flow into that nation. So it was that squadron flying AH-1Js really established a great tradition for this type of aircraft and those squadrons. And there's actually, Sea Cobras have been a part of naval aviation pretty much from that time on. They're now in very much an advanced version of this basic platform called the AH-1Z. And the museum just received an AH-1W that was flown here and made a part of our collection early in 2020. So this is the last of the quarterdeck aircraft here, and I hope you've enjoyed this tour of how we present the gamut of naval aviation here in the quarterdeck when you first arrive. And so now I'll be happy to take any questions you may have about any of these aircraft or anything related to the museum and naval aviation.
Great, we do have some questions today, Hill, and the first one comes from Justin Foster, and he says, why did Grumman name a majority of its aircraft after cats?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know why specifically they did, but certainly various aircraft manufacturers tended to follow trends or traditions in their aircraft. Like, for example, Douglas, a lot of their products, the Sky Warrior, the Skyhawk, and the same with Grumman. They just tended to name after cats. I can tell you why the Tomcat was named the Tomcat, and that related to the fact that there was an admiral named Vice Admiral Tom Connolly, and he was the one who actually campaigned for the F-14 Tomcat in place of an aircraft that was trying to be put forth for both Air Force and Navy service called the F-111. And so supposedly, in honor of his efforts, the Tomcat was named the Tomcat. But certainly, Grumman definitely has a feline tradition.
So the next question comes from Tarba, and she says, hello, are there any helos hung over the quarterdeck?
There certainly are. It's actually the one right above me, which is the AH-1J Cobra. And we have a lot of helicopters throughout the museum, some really notable ones as far as history is concerned. There are a lot of them in Hangar Bay 1, and particularly the most popular one in there is definitely Marine One, a Marine One helicopter that flew during the Nixon and Ford administrations, which we've covered in one of our History Up Close presentations.
So she also asks, who builds the carrier models that are on display in the museum?
The models come from a variety of sources. Some are manufacturers' models, which are built by the companies that make the carriers, particularly Newport News Shipbuilding. There also are ones that are just made by master model makers it's just their hobby, and there are others that are just model companies. So, but they are definitely labors of love and tremendous works of art in their own right, and for our visitors, give a great perspective on how the carrier has evolved over the years.
So, and I'll tack onto that a little bit. How much do you think one of these models might cost to build? Or does it vary?
That's a good question. I think it varies. It varies on the size, certainly in the scale, the number of aircraft that go into them. But I think the people who build them, I know for the sake of the individuals, cost is really not an object for them. They devote. It's just the hours. That's really the true cost is the hours of time that they take to make.
We have a question from Mike. He says, I've noticed on my visits that the guns on the A4 are not properly staggered. Can you weigh into why this may be, or do you have plans on adjusting them?
Well, that's a good question, Mike. I don't know why that is, and I will bring it to the attention of our aircraft restoration staff, so I don't really have a timetable on when a fix like that would be made, but thank you very much. We always are amazed, or I am certainly, when people walk in here, the sharp eyes our visitors have towards, with respect to things on our aircraft.
So, and we have our last question of the day, and it comes from Emmy, who is 4 years old. And he says, why do broken airplanes go into museums?
Well, that's a good question, Emmy. The aircraft are really not necessarily broken when they arrive here. The reason they come into museums generally is newer ones have come out to replace them. So we're happy to get those older aircraft so we can make them stay alive for a lot longer. But that's the last question we have today. So I want to thank you for being with us today for our History Up Close series. We're going to take a hiatus next week, but please stay tuned to our social media accounts, which will provide you with the latest updates on when our next broadcast is going to be. But in the meantime, to all of our Facebook fans out there, I hope you have a very happy 4th of July.